Ja, en dan vanuit Zuidoost gaan we naar de Melkweg. Daar is de Cannabiscup 1999 nog deze hele week te zien. Maar we laten u ook wat interviews zien uit 1998. Veel plezier.
Oh, all the little lights inside. Oh, darling, all the little lights inside. I'm going to let it shine. All the little lights inside. I'm going to let it shine. Shine, 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 shine. You'll get right. Shine, 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 shine. You'll get right. Shine your light, shine your light on the wilderness. Shine your light, shine your light on the wilderness. Shine your light, shine your light in the wilderness. Shine your light in the wilderness over there. Come take a sip, take a sip, take another sip. Oh, fast and never let go. Our brother is a brother and a sister is a sister. Hold fast and never let go. Take a sip, take a sip.
Good afternoon. We're here at the Hotel Ter Dam during the Cannabis Cup interviewing Michka, a celebrity of note, a scholar of international acclaim, and an authority on, or perhaps a point of view from the French situation with respect to cannabis and Europe. Michka, thank you for being here today.
Hello.
Could you give us a little background on your participation in the Cannabis Cup, in the cannabis political action realities here in Europe?
So there's several ways I could understand your question. If you mean why am I here asked as a celebrity judge, well, I would imagine it has something to do with the fact that I have written 3 books on the subject of cannabis over a period of almost 20 years. The third one came out very recently, and actually printed on hemp paper, of course, and it came out actually at the same time as I was having a trial in Paris that attracted some attention. I was being sued by Gabriel Nejas for slander. I could elaborate on any of those.
Well, the trial itself, you mentioned in the press conference that you were found guilty but only charged with 1 franc. So in some ways this is a victory, even though it's legally not a victory.
Yeah, it's a defeat for me, but it's a defeat that had its good sides. One of the good sides was that there was a lot of media coverage, and most of the media coverage went in what I would call the right direction, and also the judgment itself signified, I think, quite clearly to Gabriel Nejas, that although he wins this time, it could be the last time and not to try it again.
I see. And was this over cannabis? I'm not familiar with the details of the case.
Well, it's not one of those cases in which you can go very easily. Very easily in a short time. What you can say that Gabriel Nejas is the scientist that has been given Western governments good conscience on scientific ground, so-called, for saying that cannabis is a deadly substance.
Right, potentially dangerous.
That it destroys your brain, that it makes you infertile, that different times at different periods over the last 20 or 30 years, he's come up with different scares, which were that men would grow breast, or that there was that you would get AIDS from smoking cannabis and so on.
I see. So you should always wear a condom when you're smoking cannabis. Is that what his recommendation is?
It's not exactly quite like that.
Well, now you are a scholar and you've written these 3 books about cannabis. Could you tell us about the latest one?
Okay, the latest one, it's in French. I would really love to have it in English as soon as possible. It's called Le Chanvre, Renaissance du Cannabis, which means hemp, the renaissance of cannabis, or perhaps it would translate as the renaissance of marijuana. You could debate on that. In any case, it's a book. Okay, so we have this hemp revival, and it's something that's really interesting to look at, and it's very interesting to look at, not to say hemp is going to save the world, though hemp is a very interesting plant, and it has a lot to bring for building or paper or clothing or even food. But it's even more interesting to look at this phenomenon, the revival of hemp, as a social current, and see what it brings with itself, who it takes in, and what impact it's going to have on the prohibition of cannabis and on society at large. Because, of course, the fact that the hemp movement has connected with, say, the green movement gives it a very wide footage. No, that's not it. Any feet to stand on a large basis. So I think this is, to have pot smokers and green people come together under one banner, I think it's bound to have an impact on society and on the prohibition of cannabis per se.
Well, the prohibition of cannabis brings us to the current question in the European Union about Holland's rather tolerant attitude towards it, and the rest of Europe's, most notably France's, rigid prohibition of it. Do you think that this is a politically determined thing for Chirac to maintain his position, making a lot of noise about something that in fact may not really be important? If this renaissance, if this flow towards hemp is coming, I mean, the French are growing it, as I understand.
I think in this business, Chirac is just being faithful to his set of values, that his sensitivity, his friends, everything around him will tend to make him think, like he said publicly, that there is no such thing as soft drugs, no difference between cannabis and heroin, say. But okay, now we have Chirac, and tomorrow we'll have someone else. It's in a way more interesting to me, in any case, to go a bit further and look at things from a wider angle. And it seems to me that what we have now, okay, we have a drug war. We really have a drug war, and that is a war on people that take drugs. And one interesting aspect, at least the one I'm interested in this war, is that it's a global war. It's a planetary thing, right. And so we have the Americans and the French, who are the crusaders against it, and then of course we have Holland, that has for 20 years been the symbol of tolerance. And so we are at a very particular time in history, it seems, where at the very time when Holland is getting so much pressure from the French that they have to signify quite clearly to the rest of the world that okay, we've been too liberal. That's what they're signifying. They're sending those signals in a way by bringing the limit down to 5 grams and so on. But there is something that I find very interesting in this, which is at the same time they managed to move forward, I feel, towards the situation in Holland, though it could look like it's going back, in a way it's also going forward, because now it's quite clear that you can grow 4 plants, whereas before it was only a tolerance. And I think we are nevertheless coming closer in Holland to the point where there will be a true legalization, while at the same time sending signals that it's not the case. And then, it's a long way around, but then I think the important thing is to see that in this war there are many fronts, and you can't judge what the state of the war is if you don't look at all the fronts, and if you don't look at the same time at what's happening in Holland and in Germany and in France and in Switzerland, where very incredible things are happening, and in Italy and all of these different Western countries. And there are small battles being won on all of those fronts, and so you have to take all of those battles together to try and imagine how much you've gained.
Well, the French courtiers are using hemp in their latest fashions. I've heard that Armani and perhaps Gucci are introducing hemp products as part of their fashion. Is this what you've heard? Do you think that fashion will push hemp into the mainstream?
Well, there is a keen interest for hemp in France, in couture, in the high fashion world. So it's always a case of, is there, finding enough hemp fabric we're talking about now, and readily available, and at such a price that it can really go into the people that make a lot of clothes. A number of them are interested. There's still a number of there is more demand than supply at this point. That's part of it.
And do you feel that countries around the world are beginning to plant it because this demand is going to create a market? Or will the legislation against growing hemp...
There's a big confusion between growing hemp. With American in particular have focused on growing because they can't grow hemp. So they focused on growing with the impression that if they were allowed to grow it, then all of the other problems would disappear. But the cruel fact is that if you are allowed to grow hemp and you grow hemp, all you have is, dry stalks, and you're still a long way from the fabric. And so there was a way to process the stalk in the old days where you just stuck them in a pond and did all sorts of demanding manual work, which people don't want to do in this day and age, in this society. So we really have to devise other ways. And other ways are being devised and have been devised. So now it's a case of who is going to make the large investment, and it has to be a large one, for a large-scale hemp processing to happen. So it's beginning to happen. It's in the process of happening in different parts of the world. It's happening here in Holland. It's happening in Germany. It's even happening in France. It's happening in a number of places.
Well, it appears to be a fledgling industry, and as you said, needs an injection of big money to move it into a middle-range industry, is what I hear you saying. They were quoting $200 million as the sales for the hemp industry this past year, which is not what we would call a big industry, but it's growing.
The point is that there is a number of people who have developed such a strong tie with the plants, cannabis, that they're willing to pay more for their clothes to have them made of cannabis, and they're willing to pay more for their paper. And so this demand for something that didn't exist has in itself created products that weren't around anymore, which is something quite fascinating, unlike anything else that I know of.
Well, let's turn to a more personal side. You're a proponent of this revolution in cannabis. How did you get involved with cannabis in the first place?
Well, a long time ago, really long time ago, because anyway, I immigrated to Canada, and I was a teacher in those days, and I came with all of the preconceived ideas that one had, and many people still have in France about cannabis. I thought it was something, don't touch it. Whatever you do, don't touch it. And then I discovered that some of the people I liked best in Canada were smoking pot and didn't even think twice about it. So there was obviously something wrong with what I knew of it. So it set me into. I did a lot of reading at that point, in depth. From all the reports, so many governments have had so many good people really work on the subject and come up with all sorts of reports. That's in the early 70s, late 60s, or even before that. And all of the reports always said, they said different things, but there was something in common. They always said that people shouldn't go to jail for smoking pot. That's one thing they all agreed on. And of course, the Dutch government was the only government that took notice of this report. None of the other countries ever took any notice, and that's how we end up having the Dutch exception in Europe. Mm-hmm. Listening to the expert that you've commissioned, that's what made the difference.
The Dutch exception, the Dutch acceptance.
So okay, this took us away from the personal angle. So the personal angle is looking back now, so this was 25 years ago, and looking back, I can say that cannabis has been a friend to me, and even a guidance.
And how would you say it's guided you? I mean, do you use it to write your books?
I find that it's good to use sometimes when I'm writing books, just as it's good sometimes to read what I have written when stoned, without smoking. Right. It's good to have both angles always.
Well, the altered state of consciousness, once you've acknowledged that there's more than one, the possibilities are endless. So certainly the creative aspect applies itself well to cannabis smoking. I wanted to know how you felt about the cannabis cup. I wouldn't say that this has been a particularly good weather for partying and enjoying oneself. So have you had a good time?
I've had a good time. I always have a good time when I come at the Cannabis Cup, and this, I think, is my fourth. I always have a good time because, coming from France, this is the land of freedom as far as smoking pot is concerned, and this is great. But the main reason why I have a good time when I come here at this time is because you can meet all these great people. I'm really happy to meet Denis Perron, for instance, and this is a great place to do it because, we're each out of all those things that eat up our lives and free to meet. And that's good. That's how you make strong connection with the people that are doing things. And this is how a sort of it contributes to making a network happen, to taking us all into a network. And as I said, it's a planetary war, and it can only be won, I think, when unite. Stoners of the world unite. Is it?
Right. I just had one more question about Denis Perron, who's sort of the figurehead for the Proposition 215 movement, which made medical use of marijuana legal in California just several weeks ago. Now he's become a figurehead, as you are, I would assume, a figurehead for the movement. How does this affect you? How can you redirect the energy back to people who are, out there, probably smoking surreptitiously, still in the closet? Do you think that it's better for people to organize, demonstrate, go out into the streets, smoke pot in groups of 1,000 so that policing is impossible?
Well, earlier on I said that pot has been a guidance to me, and so a bit later, a few seconds later, I was thinking to myself, well, how was it a guidance? And I think what it did for me was to allow me to become more myself in a way. And I think, which is to say that that there is as many answers as many different people, and as far as I'm concerned, I feel that almost the best thing I can do now, as perhaps a figurehead, is just be myself.
That's safe. Well, we've been very fortunate to have you here as yourself, and we hope that the rest of the week goes as well, and that you stay high and happy and green.